1957, a journalist from the New York Times went on something of an odyssey to meet a man rumored to be dead. His name was Herbert Matthews, the man, insurgent leader Fidel Castro. Matthews made contact through an underground group in Havana, Cuba, before embarking on a treacherous journey. 500 miles by jeep across the island to the Sierra Maestra Mountains, driving along back roads and through sugarcane and rice fields, slithering through miles of mud and wading through icy waters, all while avoiding Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista's patrol guards and road blockades. The men assisting Matthews along his journey whispered of violent repression from the dictatorship. One said, "I'd rather be here fighting for Fidel than anywhere in the world right now," after he witnessed his brother executed by Batista's officers. Finally, Matthews met Fidel Castro. He wrote, "In honor of the occasion, Senor Castro broke open a box of good Havana cigars, and for the next 3 hours we sat there while he talked. No one could talk above a whisper at any time." Soon after, an enamored Matthews published his article in the New York Times. It opened, "Fidel Castro, the rebel leader of Cuba's youth, is alive and fighting hard and successfully." Matthews not only painted Castro as a heroic romantic figure, but his movement's success as an inevitability. Even with Castro's measly crew of 18, which had been picked off by desertions and deaths, Matthews wrote, "From the looks of things, General Batista cannot possibly hope to suppress the Castro revolt." As William Buckley later wrote of this portrait, "There is seething discontent with dictator Batista, corrupt and degenerate, after virtually 25 years of exercising power, hated by most Cubans for having installed himself as president in March of 1952 by military coup, become now a terrorist and a torturer." Fidel, on the other hand, was painted as a great future liberator. Fidel told Herbert, "We are fighting for a democratic Cuba and an end to the dictatorship." And in response to concerns about Marxism, Matthews wrote, "There is no communism to speak of in Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement." Within a month of the article publishing, Castro's ranks grew to 80, and within 2 years, he had captured the island. We now know that Fidel Castro would become a self-proclaimed Marxist-Leninist, that the revolution was socialist, and that he would evade promises of democracy and install himself as leader for nearly 5 decades. His regime would brutalize, murder, imprison, harass, and indoctrinate Cubans for more than half a century. But in the beginning, it all seemed so well-intentioned. Hey everyone, and welcome to Indoctrination. I thought it was time for a video on how Cuba became a socialist country, how Castro came to power and retained it, how an island became trapped in time, and what might become of it now that socialism is falling throughout Latin America. I also had the pleasure of speaking with Gaby Blanco, a friend from Cuba, who will share her perspective later in this video. But first, I want to start with a story about another woman who left the island. In 1993, Elena Fernandez disguised herself as a Spanish tourist and crossed into the United States. She was Cuban, fleeing her home country, and like many Cuban refugees, would become an outspoken critic of the regime. Only Elena's betrayal was not only to her homeland and comrades, but her own father, Fidel Castro. 40 years earlier, her mother, Havana socialite Natalia Revuelta, met Castro at underground meetings of the Orthodox Party. Fidel was a passionate young revolutionary and scorned political candidate whose election was canceled when the country's reins of power were seized by Fulgencio Batista in 1952. The Cuban Revolution, in part, began in Natalia's home, where the insurgents planned their first big attack. In the days leading up to the 1953 attack, roughly 160 revolutionaries piled into 20 cars and drove 800 miles to Santiago de Cuba, where they disguised themselves as carnival goers. In the wee hours of the morning on July 26th, they launched simultaneous attacks on barracks in Bayamo and Santiago, but were quickly defeated. 55 of Castro's men were killed. Many others were captured and thrown into prison, including Fidel and his brother Raul. While in prison, Fidel wrote and distributed an alleged 100,000 copies of his courtroom speech, "History Will Absolve Me," a sign of his later penchant for propaganda. He also penned letters to Natalia, one reading, "I am on fire. Write to me, for I cannot be without your letters." In less than 2 years, Fidel and his brother were out of prison, having their sentences commuted by the man they tried to overthrow. But before fleeing to Mexico, Fidel impregnated Natalia. Alina was born as the Castro brothers trained for guerrilla warfare in the mountains of Mexico alongside Argentine revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara. Their motto, in 1956, "We will be free or we will be martyrs." True to their word, in 1956, 82 revolutionaries boarded the yacht Granma and headed to the mountains in Cuba. But within 2 months, Fidel's men were down to just 18 due to battlefield deaths and desertions, and it was then he decided to do something brilliant. Fidel invited the media, the American media, specifically a journalist from the New York Times named Herbert Matthews. And in my estimation, this is the moment Cuba's fate changed. Then more journalists came. Public support in Cuba and abroad swelled. Castro and his boys pinky promised to hold free elections when this whole thing was over. They battled throughout Cuba, arming peasant farmers. Che Guevara later wrote, "We understood that the peasants' yearning for land was the most powerful motive of struggle that could be found in Cuba." On January 8, 1959, Fidel Castro rode into the streets of Havana wearing a peaked fatigue cap and a rifle and declared victory. The Batistas fled the country, and a month later, Fidel was appointed prime minister of the revolutionary government.
Look at me, sure. Look at me, sure. I'm the captain now.
Somewhere in the city, his daughter was growing up in wildly changing times. Her assumed father, the now ex-husband of Natalia, fled to America, and Alina noticed the man on TV began coming around more often.
So until I was 10 years old, I thought my father was this bad guy that abandoned the country, which I loved because I have the greatest memories also about Orlando Fernandez, right? Right down in school, if you have people that abandon the country, they made it precisely humiliating for you. You were like stigmatized. So when suddenly Fidel Castro became my father, it was like, oh, that's a release.
When Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba, he had the world fooled. He was not an out Marxist yet, and he claimed to want democracy for Cuba.
Will all political parties be allowed to run candidates in these elections?
Of course, if we don't give free to all the political parties to organize, we are not democratic. We believe in democracy.
The free elections never came. At first, the US government was only mildly concerned, but then a bunch of Cuban exiles started showing up on our shores. The revolutionary government nationalized American companies and took their property, and Cuba became best buddies with the USSR, America's Cold War nemesis. That's when our relations soured. Eisenhower declared an economic embargo designed to put pressure on the country, but things really ramped up under Kennedy's presidency. The Kennedy brothers, JFK and RFK, were kind of like the Americanized version of the Castros, Fidel and Raul. It was the perfect head-to-head 2v2 challenge, but with lots of money, missiles, and ammunition. The US began training Cuban exiles for a large-scale attack in 1960, and in 1961 carried out the infamous Bay of Pigs attack, which was a massive failure. The plan was to trick Cuba into not knowing we were involved while using US planes painted to look like Cuban military planes and Cuban exiles as the ground troops, which in retrospect seems more like a plot from Scooby-Doo than a secure military strategy. The invasion also prompted Fidel Castro to say, "I am a Marxist-Leninist," with his full chest, no more beating around the bush. And soon, the future of Cuba became a point of obsession for the Kennedys. It was then they planned Operation Mongoose. In late 1961, Bobby Kennedy wrote, "My idea is to stir things up on the island with espionage, sabotage, general disorder, run and operated by Cubans themselves." But the Kennedys overestimated their support on the island, and a CIA national intelligence estimate found that it was Castro who had amassed widespread support in Cuba. While it is unclear if the Kennedys knew of the coming assassination plots carried out by the CIA, the team charged with the operation was told to, quote, "get rid of Castro and the Castro regime." So they hired a mafia hitman named Johnny Rosselli to do the job. that failed.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
And these attempts only further entrenched the narrative in Cuba that America was a violent imperialist nation hell-bent on destroying the revolution and exploiting the island's resources and people. Tensions between the US and Cuba came to a head in 1962 when US aircraft spotted missile sites being constructed on the island to hold nuclear missiles sent from the USSR, prompting the US to do a naval blockade, which the state called a quarantine. The world was under the threat of nuclear war in a very real way, prompting Nikita Khrushchev and JFK to negotiate an agreement where the US vowed to not invade the island and the missiles were removed. Meanwhile, in Cuba, the Castro regime was pumping out the propaganda, aided by the very real actions of the United States, who had prematurely attacked the regime while it maintained popular support at home. The propaganda machine established by the Castros was so powerful that generations of Cubans participated in their own demise, and millions more around the world, especially throughout Latin America, were seduced by the false promises of Marxism. A tourist driving through Cuba will see no companies advertising on billboards, just massive pictures of revolutionary heroes and slogans like Viva Fidel, patriotism or death, socialism or death, and Fidel, we are with you. These posters are often beautiful and vibrant, but they follow Cubans everywhere like a giant Big Brother is watching you sign. And the regime is watching. I invited my friend Gaby to share her experiences with propaganda in the Cuban classroom, one of the most foundational tools used by the regime to create compliance and loyalty.
There were always keywords that the revolution used and Castro used from day one to make you feel that you were part of a collective and to make you forget that you weren't an individual. You had to remove all of that from your reality. So you walk into the classroom, you have pictures all over the place of Castro, Che Guevara, all the figures of the revolution. Sing the national anthem, swear your oath. Everything that you study in class is about who was Fidel and how he came to power and how the United States is getting ready to invade us. You're never just a kid. You have to always be ready for battle. You have to be ready. You have to know how to work a weapon. You have to be ready to fight back.
Che Guevara said youth should learn to think and act as a mass. It is criminal to think as individuals, which means ideas that threaten the collective cannot be allowed. A complex system of surveillance was constructed and enforced by both official security officers and paramilitary groups in order to keep people silent. And now, Cuba ranks as 165 out of 180 countries for press freedom, the worst in Latin America. The Black Spring, a period of heightened repression, began in 2003 with the arrest of 27 journalists who were accused of collaborating with the United States by reporting on the abysmal living conditions in Cuba and other unsavory information about the regime. These journalists had their phones tapped and suffered brutal prison conditions, torture, and beatings for their brave reporting. In 2005, independent journalist Guillermo Fariñas was targeted by a large group of paramilitary revolutionaries for his anti-Castro comments made on a Miami radio broadcast. When he refused to say "Long live Fidel Castro," he was beaten so badly that he could no longer type with his swollen hands. Some have faced far worse. According to the Cuba Archive, thousands have died by firing squad or extrajudicial assassinations, and sadly, at least 94 children have been murdered by the regime. And Che Guevara himself, the man whose face appears on the shirts of young progressives in the United States, ordered 151 Cubans to be lined up and executed at La Habana Fortress in 1959. He once wrote, "We reject any peaceful approach. Violence is inevitable. To establish socialism, rivers of blood must flow. And if any person has a good word for the previous government, that is good enough for me to have him shot." This was the foundational belief of the Castro regime, under which Cubans have suffered for nearly 70 years. Make no mistake, they haven't taken that lying down. Cubans have bravely stood up to their government in spite of risks, and many have fled. In 2022 and 2023 alone, 10% of Cuba's population fled the country, with nearly 650,000 coming to the United States. Throughout Castro's regime, Cubans have been arriving in the United States on foot, by plane, on boats, and even makeshift rafts, which is how 30,000 Cubans attempted to make the journey to Florida during the Balsero crisis of 1994. They are fleeing more than just political repression and human rights violations. They are fleeing a dire economic situation. Rampant inflation, crumbling infrastructure, food shortages, and rolling blackouts characterize the experience of Cubans still living on the island. At the center is an energy crisis. In 2011, Cuba received 96,000 barrels of oil from Venezuela per day. Last year, it fell to a third of that. And now, with their greatest ally, Nicolas Maduro, being seized by the United States on narco-terrorism conspiracy charges, the Cuban economy is in free fall. The New York Times called it the worst economic moment in the 67-year history of its communist revolution. Economist Mauricio de Miranda said Cuba has a collapsed productive sector, meaning it faces a serious problem of supply shortages. This means that the country must import goods to meet basic needs, especially food and fuel, but also manufactured goods. With dwindling international allies and support, the pressure is on. In some areas, residents report 20 hours a day without electricity. Monthly food stipends reportedly only stretch 10 days in recent years, with the cards now being virtually worthless as there's no food left at the government-run stores. Private grocery stores have been allowed on the island since 2021, but prices are so high and wages so low that it's not really an option for most Cubans. In fact, low wages and currency devaluation make it nearly impossible to afford the basic necessities of life.
My salary is only 3,000 pesos. 3,000 pesos is nothing. 3,000 pesos is one chicken, one packet chicken. You know, it's 5 kilo chicken. Everything is very expensive in Cuba.
According to the New York Times, one resident of Havana, the capital, said he joined the queue for gasoline 3 months ago and is now number 5,052 in line. And without gas, there's no trash pickup, so the streets are lined with garbage, which breeds mosquitoes and disease. President Miguel Diaz-Canel, who was announced as Raul Castro's successor in 2018, said the top priority is food production and making the state-run industries more productive. The only problem is, state-run industry is the whole problem. Without price signals, private property, and privatization of industry, Cuba will not remain stuck in time. It will rapidly deteriorate. And it already has. Cuba didn't look like this in 1959.
Todas estas habitaciones son pequeñas así, pero dentro viven 10 personas. Tenemos las camas. Después que cierra la puerta, todo es cama.
Entonces, eso se convierte en una cama.
Esto de aquí es otra cama que pones aquí.
Okay.
Y arriba hay
So this is the bathroom.
el cubo y te bañas.
And where do you get water? ¿Hay un llave?
No, o sea, tomamos el agua de abajo,
Okay.
la cargamos con pomos.
In any moment, this could fall down.
The communist leadership in Cuba can't keep up their end of the bargain. One resident said the bare minimum of goods that guaranteed a certain social equality is no longer respected, and now medicine and care is very difficult to come by.
Si vas con medicina, no la hay en la botica, la tiene particular. Si buscas un poco de aceite,
Fresh drinking water is also in short supply. Roughly 1 million people, 10% of the population, face shortages due to the energy crisis. In the past, Cuba has been able to justify economic hardship by blaming the United States. But now, with such a dire situation, will those justifications fall flat?
I was born in 1990, which was the middle of what we call the special period. And that came about after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The food rationing system, we had more than we do now, but it was never plenty. Cuba produces virtually nothing at this point, and the subsidies are not there like they used to be. But the situation is more dire than ever today, because it's been almost 7 decades. Cuba really has nowhere to go from here, except for a change.
Younger generations are not buying it anymore. Many of their family members have fled to the United States, and they don't remember the hardships under Batista or the freshness of Castro's ideas. Cubans who come to America tend to be outspoken critics of communism and ardent supporters of American entrepreneurship and free markets, including Castro's own daughter.
Oh, the freedom is everything. How you describe freedom?
Wasn't that difficult for you to be free at the first time, or?
No, it's not difficult to be free. What is difficult is to learn your rights and your duties by being free. I didn't lose anything by coming here because I never owned anything. In a communist country, you don't own anything. Anything can be taken away from you at any time.
These exiles are often dismissed by American socialists as former landowners, but those insults fall flat in the face of so much suffering and human rights abuses. It really comes down to who is fleeing where. I don't see American socialists boarding makeshift rafts to Havana to starve in a crumbling flat while living 10 people to a room. Any takers? Many journalists and tourists who have made the trip to Cuba recently have come back with a much different opinion on the Castros than Herbert Matthews did back in 1957. The situation in Cuba is so dire that I wonder if this Castro regime will soon come to an end. I hope you all enjoyed this video, first of 2026. It's been a crazy year already. Please check out Gaby's socials in the description, along with links to other videos and resources. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave me a comment with what you want to see next. See you guys next time. Ciao.